numerous women, including some of the figures presented on today's concert, did in fact compose highly ambitious, large-scale, public-facing works, engaging very creatively and very originally with some of the genres and forms that are central to the classical canon. One fact that emerges as we look at all of these histories is really that there's no one single history of women composers, no one-size-fits-all historical narrative. Every so often I'm asked, like, oh, can you give like a short overview of the history of women in classical music? And it's like, well, that is basically the history of classical music. Essentially, there is no facet of this genre, of this tradition that does not have a diverse history, if only you look carefully at the historical record and the historical evidence. And one thing we'll see about the composers on this afternoon's concert is that they took many different pathways to composition, that they had different ways in which their social milieu limited or empowered them, and also different ways in which they engage with their broader cultural and social context. I'll offer commentary on just a few of these composers. It would be outrageously long and you would get really sick of hearing me talk if I talked about every single piece, but I'll step in and offer a little bit of background about 3 or 4 of the composers on this afternoon's program. And the first one, which our wind quintet's going to offer, offers a really good example of how women were involved in practically every development in the history of classical music. It's first 2 movements of a wind quintet by a composer named Louise-Marie Simon. And her life and career spanned the 20th century in France. She got as prestigious an education as one could get in early 20th century France. She studied at the Paris Conservatoire, which is still one of the premier institutions for music study in the world. One of her teachers was Paul Dukas, whose works you have heard if you've seen Walt Disney's Fantasia. He wrote The Sorcerer's Apprentice, among other things. And after graduation, Louise-Marie Simon had her finger on the pulse of many important developments in modernist French music. She worked in French radio and did electronic sound effects for French radio programs. The quintet you're going to hear today is part of a boom of chamber music for winds that forms a cornerstone of the 20th century modernist musical literature. And yet, you may have noticed from your program that she wrote under a pseudonym, Claude Arieux. I was unable to track down exactly why. Information about her is a little bit tricky to find, but I think it's reasonable to hypothesize that gender and the reception of female composers was a reason why, or as some of my colleagues say, not a reason why. Women composers from the 19th century well into the 20th were often at best treated with condescension by the classical music establishment. And that's especially true when they wrote in these large classically based forms like chamber music. Again, there were assumptions about how gender affected one's ability to create musical architecture and counterpoint among different melodic lines. And for the record, those assumptions are all nonsense. The ability to construct satisfying musical architecture in large-scale pieces knows no gender. It's composers from any gender identity, any cultural group, who have engaged with that facet of classical composition. For French composers of Simon's generation, one of the appeals of wind chamber music was precisely that, counterpoint. These composers were often called neoclassical, in that they urged a return to quote-unquote classical values of clarity and transparency. It was kind of a reaction against the overheated emotionalism of the Romantic era. And one of the special rewards of listening to and playing music from this period is that because all these wind instruments have different timbres, you can hear each melodic line in high definition. They don't blend and fuse together in quite the same way as a string quartet does. And so when composers of Simone's generation were trying to get that sense of clarity and transparency, no pressure, guys, they often turn to mixed woodwind ensembles. So enjoy the Wind Quintet by Louise Marie Simone, and I'll be back to talk about Fanny Hensel when we play her later.